And uh, I'd like to start this week talking about the flood in Texas. It is horrific. There is a mounting loss of life. It looks like it's going to be more than 300 people by the time they have finished search rescue and what is probably now just a recovery phase that they are in. Um, and Christian nationalists feel a certain kind of way about these things happening that uh, is not the way people expect who they think of as traditionally Christian to react. Can you
Mhm.
talk us through that some?
Well, first of all, I want to say if you're in Texas or around Texas or have a connection to this tragedy, I'm so sorry, and you have my complete solidarity and support. I've heard from my own subscribers who are struggling with this. I don't care how you voted. I don't care what your beliefs are. Tragedies like this are human and they're horrific and they hurt regardless of politics. And so I do want to offer that piece of solidarity. It has been quite horrifying to me to see people say, well, this is what they voted for. Um, and
Nobody
while it
votes for this.
nobody
Nobody
votes for
votes for
that.
this.
And so I want to say that right out of the gate. But I also want to stress that Project 2025 called for the defunding of FEMA, dismantling of FEMA, the dismantling of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service, and the privatizing of all of that. When we talk about Project 2025 project or policy positions, they really aren't predictions. It looks like I was just really prescient talking about predicting what they were going to do, but they said very candidly that they were going to do these things if they were given power. So I was just telling people what they said they would do. And I'm so sorry that they really meant that they said what they said they would do, because
Yeah,
now they're
they
doing it.
published it.
Yeah.
They published it. The media didn't do what it needed to do
Mhm.
with that document, and here we are.
And groups like us tried to get
Yep.
more people to pay attention to it, but not enough people did in America. So, what's happening with disaster recovery was completely laid out in Project 2025. This should surprise absolutely no one. But watching these sanctimonious asshole Republicans parade before microphones and cameras and say, we just need to pray, makes me want to scream. As a former Christian nationalist myself, I know what they're really saying when they say that. And so, one of the things that I've been writing about and wanted to talk about today is what they're really saying, so that more Americans can understand how to push back on that talking point and try to neutralize it. So, I hope we can do that now if you want to.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So when Christian nationalist politicians like Mike Johnson go on Meet the Press and say, well, we're just really going to have to pray, after they just voted to gut everything to do with American safety net, American security, American science, American weather research and infrastructure and other infrastructure. What he's really saying to you Americans is God is judging America for its sexual immorality and its rejection of him. And it's so rampant and so raging across the country, and when God decides to judge a country, sometimes he judges good people too. The good people have to suffer too. He doesn't just judge the bad people. But these storms, these kinds of disasters are part of God's judgment, because we as a nation have rejected him. There's all this sexual immorality that we have to root out. And until Americans get it together and stop sinning so much and come back to God and have a revival and turn from their wicked ways and see the one true God, God is going to keep judging our country with things like these disasters. And so all we can really do is pray that more Americans will see the error of their ways and will turn back to God. And that's just really all we can offer. That's all we can do. It's just so sad that so many Americans want to reject God and live these immoral lives. And so that's really what he's saying.
Yeah, it's the same thing that they're really saying after every school shooting or mass shooting in other locations. They are not saying, let's pray that, um, this never happens again. It it is prayer for Americans to fall under under the umbrella of Christian nationalism and take up those beliefs and act accordingly. And if we can just pray hard enough so all Americans, or if we can't pray them into it, we'll find ways to force them into it. We will
By
just
making Christian
govern that
nationalist
way.
laws. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right. So yeah, talk a little bit about that.
So the underpinnings of Project 2025 were very much centered around making laws that were derived from Christian nationalist interpretations of the Bible. Because whatever type of Christian nationalist you are, you believe that the Bible is God's law. It's God's perfect law. Any law that man makes that differs from their interpretation of God's perfect law, because I mean, let's face it, 10 different people can read the same verse and have 10 different meanings, but their meaning is the right meaning.
The right one.
So, so they believe that it is their calling by God to force our secular laws to match their interpretation of God's law. So that was baked into Project 2025 and how they approached Project 2025. One of the reasons they want to gut all federal government aid to people is because they want to provide any help that gets provided, any kind of assistance, was set out to be religious indoctrination in exchange for help. So you can see examples like that today if you go to a gospel mission, for unhoused people. And they have all these rules that the people there have to live under in order to keep staying there. So they have to attend chapel services and they have to attend a counseling session with somebody who isn't really trained anything. They just read the Bible and pray with people. They have curfews. They can't date. They have to, sometimes give an accounting of what they've done every day or every week to make sure that they're not doing things that are wrong. If they violate rules, I mean, I read about one case in, I believe, Minnesota, where a man got a job, but the job interfered with going to the required chapel service, so they kicked him out for going to the required chapel service. So they're very rigid about these rules that people have to follow to get help, which, is nothing even remotely resembling what Jesus did. But so that is kind of baked into this notion of prayer as well. If people get miserable enough, if they lose enough, if they hurt enough, if they're desperate enough,
If they're sick enough.
if they're sick enough, if they just lose enough, then they'll be more receptive to this religious indoctrination. They'll be more receptive to to living by these rules to have some relief in their lives. So that's another aspect of what they're saying to you when they get in front of a microphone. And this is going to happen repeatedly in the coming months. We are getting ready to go into the hardcore part of hurricane season. And unless, we're really, really lucky, somebody's going to get hit with a major hurricane in the coming months. And that's going to be the entire thing that they're going to offer to Americans who are devastated. We're going to hear this over and over again.
We're starting to hear reports of what the conditions are in the concentration camp that they have built in Florida and are sending, um, I don't even want to say they're sending undocumented um, people there because they're sending people with documentation there, and they are sending people who are legally in the United States who would normally go through our criminal justice, have recently committed a crime and should be going through the normal criminal justice system and be held pretrial or whatever. Um, they're being sent there too. So expect that U.S. citizens are going to be sent to this concentration camp, and the things we're hearing are n- no, very little water or no water, one meal a day, and maggots in the food. Obviously, no air conditioning, and this is the Florida Everglades in July, so we know what that's like. Um, these tents are completely porous, so mosquito infestations that are
And
not
gnats. I mean, they
and
have
that.
gnats that bite as well.
Yeah.
Those are really worse than the mosquitoes.
So, these are the conditions that, um, the Christian nationalists who now have huge power in the US government and just ever increasing, they are perfectly fine with people being in those conditions and can justify all of that. That those horrific conditions these people brought on themselves. And
Yeah, yeah.
if these, tents that were erected in a week, um, owned by a for-profit company,
And it
that's
was no bid, and they gave money to DeSantis, and it's
yep,
all just super gross and super corrupt.
yep, and can you imagine what happens to we know what happens to, mobile homes in hurricanes? Imagine what happens to tents,
And
and
there's one road in and out of there, so
yeah.
I'm sure they won't be evacuated in the event of a hurricane. So it's a really horrific example of how Christian nationalists have just completely lobotomized themselves of empathy. And this isn't just coming for undocumented people. As you say, there are already people being sent to this place that are US citizens that have been here legally. So this is not just coming for undocumented people. They are building an infrastructure to put away anyone who disagrees with them. And I wrote about this last week. Um,
You also
they
wrote about this last year. I went
and
back
last year,
and looked at, one of your pieces that you had written about, um, the the plan for these concentration camps in Project 2025. They
yeah,
wrote it all down.
they put the use of tents in there in the immigration section, and Stephen Miller wrote most of that. So that they're actually building tents should not surprise anyone. Um, but this is just a really horrible example of why I wish people had read and paid attention, because they intend to do a lot more of these, and their ultimate goal is to incarcerate anyone in them who disagrees with them. And so that should give us all extra incentive to do whatever we can do to stop them now, whether it's general striking and boycotting, or whatever it is, in a big way. Because in a few months, when ICE has all this money, America really will be a police state that looks like Los Angeles just about everywhere. There'll be no limit to where these people can go and what they can do, and they're not following any constitution to do so.
So what are some of your thoughts on what average Americans can be doing both to prepare and protect themselves, but also building community and finding ways to really be, shining a spotlight on what is happening and fighting back against it?
I'm not I always try to say what I think people need to hear, not what they want to hear. So what I'm going to say is probably not going it's people are gonna be like, "Oh, no," and that's not what I mean to give people. But, unfortunately, we're beyond the time now where we're not going to suffer. So, whatever happens next is going to be hard, and we're going to lose some things, and we need to prepare ourselves for that because this has gone too far now for everything to just go back to the way it was. And, the Supreme Court ruled yesterday that all these fired federal workers can stay fired. So, our government has been completely transformed. Even if we manage to oust all these people tomorrow, our government is not the same. And that was part of what Project 2025's goal was too. It was to change the government so fundamentally that it would take years or decades to restore it to what it was or to root out all of the changes that they had made. So we're not going back to what we had. And I don't want to do that anyway. And I've talked about that here before. We can do better than the Constitution we had written by all the rich white men who thought it was okay to own people. That's impacted so many Americans negatively the whole time we've existed. But some of the things that you can do now are really getting in touch with your community. We've become so attached to screens, and in a surveillance state, our screen may be an enemy. So we really need to be in touch physically and face to face with people in our communities who are like-minded. We have to be reaching together and forming ways to support each other. I and many other people have been writing about ways to do that. I started right after the election. Go around and knock on your neighbors' doors for people who had Kamala signs in their yards and get to know them if you don't already. People in my group have been making community gardens so that if there are supply chain issues with food, which there are going to be, they've incarcerated so many of the people who do that work, and we'll talk about another
And
aspect of that in a minute.
terrified so many others. Yeah.
Yeah, so there are gonna be food shortages, so doing things like that and canning and having chickens and all those things, people in my communities are starting to do things like that. People have been stocking up on staple goods. One of my readers has a basement full of stuff. She could probably never leave her house for a year and a half and be fine. So, people have been doing that. But you're going to have to come up with ways to stay connected to your neighbors, stay connected to your community, make sure that you're protecting the vulnerable people in your community that ICE is eventually going to be coming after so that they're not being kidnapped and abducted. We see Los Angeles doing that in real time now, where families and neighbors are taking care of people who are targeted so that they can stay and hide in their house like the Diary of Anne Frank. I'm so horrified that that is what America is becoming, but that's what's happening. So you need plans to take care of those people, identify them, make sure that you know who they are and where they are and what the plan is if ICE shows up in your neighborhood. You can certainly use multiple apps to track things like that. There are apps that you can download and use, but be careful with those because I suspect that ICE will start, you know, coming up to random people and saying, I want to search your phone and things like that. So be careful with things like that, but definitely use them because they're available. We also need to come up with ways for people to get health care and food and have their bills paid in the event that they must hide for some period of time from a predatory government. So there's a lot that you can do in your communities. Also, I've put a huge list of resources on my Substack, and you may have too, of these are the fascist companies that you don't support. There's also an app called Goods Unite Us, where you can go on and see what the politics of just about any company that you frequent have and what they give money to. It's a nonpartisan app, so there's no like bias to it. You can find out that you can put in a real fascist company because that's what you want to support, and it'll tell you, yeah, you're on the right track. So it'll give you either or, but you can use that to make sure that you're not giving money to people who are supporting this fascist government. Um, my personal approach has been not to spend any more money, to try to choke the economy as much as possible, to spend as little money as possible all the way around. If I'm going to spend money, to try to spend money locally and give it to local businesses, to minority owned businesses, to people in my community that need that support. So those are things that you can be doing now. If we really wanted to get aggressive, we could stop going to work and we could stop sending our kids to school and we could stop doing anything and grind the economy to a complete halt. And that would make a larger statement. But I don't know that enough Americans are there yet to organize and do something like that.
The other thing I would add, and you've mentioned this many times when we've talked and on your Substack, but take your fingerprints and facial recognition off your phone.
Mhm,
You do not want if you are at a protest, if you're at an airport, you do not want someone to be able to seize your phone and hold it up to your face and be able to open it.
mhm.
And if you take those things off, you are legally, you do not have to give your password to give access. I know, federal officials, they can still take your phone, but you don't have to make it easy for them to be able to go through your phone. So take all of the biometrics off your phone, off your computers, wherever you're using them. Um, we remembered passwords before, and we can do it again. Like,
Well, and
we're
and
we're Americans. We do big things.
as a corollary to that, I've started advising my subscribers. We all have old phones lying around that you really just can't do anything with those things. So what we're doing in our household is having a phone that really would go out of the house with us. It would go to an airport with us, anywhere that it might be searched, that just really has very basic stuff on it. Here's my grocery list. Here's a baseline group of contacts that I don't talk about anything incendiary with in my contact list. Here's my map app. Here, maybe is how I pay for something if I use my phone to pay for something, but no real social media, no real any apps on it. So if somebody confiscates that phone, who cares? They've not really gotten anything.
Yeah.
And so I think training ourselves to have some kind of device that we use out in public when we think we might be searched is another way to ensure that our devices and our information doesn't get confiscated by a very aggressive predatory ICE police
Yep.
force.
That's smart. And you don't even have to have a cellular plan attached to these old phones. You can use them on Wi-Fi to
Mhm,
be able
mhm.
to text message, to be able to, look things up, to get directions. You're not when you're out of a Wi-Fi area, you're not going to be able to do anything, but you can still video record on them, which is
I've been Y'all, I've been living that way for months and I'm completely fine. I don't have a cellular plan right now where I am. So when I'm out
I'm
of the
not
house,
sure that, the world as a whole wouldn't be a whole lot better if, we weren't all functioning that way.
yeah,
Andrew, I think, the less time we have to keep apprised of what's going on, but we don't have to do it every 6 seconds
yeah,
and, force ourselves into the fetal position. It's not a healthy way to live. So make sure you're giving yourselves time away from all of it
mhm,
to connect with other people and do things that bring you joy because that's what's going to sustain us is those things that give us joy and give us hope. So I know every week, Andrew, you make sure that you ask people what gave you hope this week. in your newsletter for a time such as this. Make sure
Yeah.
you subscribe to that. And I know there was one other thing that you wanted to mention. You had mentioned about I think it was related to food and
Oh,
agriculture.
yeah. Okay. So yesterday or the day before yesterday, Russ Vogt, our super evil, extremist Christian nationalist villain head of the Office of Management and Budget, got in front of a microphone on Fox Business and extolled the dignity of work. And that is a phrase that you're going to hear Republicans vomiting out of every orifice in the coming months. It underpinned the entire labor section of Project 2025. Jonathan Berry, who clerked for Sam Alito, worked to get Gorsuch on the court, authored that section. The dignity of work is Christian nationalist language, and you'd never think it is. It sounds pretty benign, but it is Christian nationalist language from Catholic dogma. And so, no surprise that Jonathan Berry, who's Catholic, would be putting that into the underpinnings of the labor document. So, whenever you hear a Republican extol the dignity of work, what they're really doing is quoting John Paul II. They're quoting the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. They're going all the way back to Genesis again. These people like to do that a lot, and talking about how God cursed Adam with having to work. And so, therefore, work is part of God's plan, and being idle is not part of God's plan. This seeped into Protestantism because, most of the people in the Reformation came from the Catholic Church and studied different forms of Catholicism. So, this seeped into Protestantism as well. If you've heard an idle mind is the devil's workshop, that actually comes from Chaucer, who was a Catholic. But my pastor said that all the time. So, growing up in a Christian nationalist Baptist church, we were constantly told that being idle, not doing anything, having an idle mind, having an idle body invited Satan into our lives and invited us to sin. And we needed to be busy all the time so that Satan couldn't have a foothold in our lives and we wouldn't be able to be sinning all the time. So
Yeah.
when Russ Vogt says the dignity of work, that's what he's really saying. Everyone who's sitting around not working is not following God's plan as outlined in Genesis to not be idle, because idleness leads to sinfulness, and that leads God to judge our country for all. So it all goes back and connects to each other. So when you hear them saying that in the coming months, what they're really doing is forcing Christian nationalist dogma on society and forcing people, in many cases, who cannot work because they are physically incapable of working, they are children, they are elderly, to not be idle because they believe their Bibles say that everybody has to be busy all the time to keep from sinning, so God will stop judging America.
And there are real gender prescribed roles for that work as well. The
God cursed
dignity.
men in that
Yes.
section. Yes, it's the same section. We've talked about this before. God cursed women because Eve sinned first, doctrine of original sin. So God cursed women with being submissive and having pain in childbirth and all of that, being moms, staying in the home. God cursed Adam with having to work and toil for his existence. And so, I cannot stress enough how much Christian nationalists go back all the way to Genesis and see all these things in it and read it literally and try to apply it to everyone and everything and then say that's God's plan.
Yeah.
So
And it all ties together, right? We have to every once in a while step back and look at the big picture of what is the hypermasculinity movement about? What is the trad wives movement about? There are so many different tendrils in both our social spheres and in government that are attempting to impose this Christian nationalist way of life on all of us. This is I if this were a Muslim extremist movement in the U.S., everybody would be up in arms over this
Exactly.
happening. But because it's Christianity, and unfortunately the traditional media is afraid to talk about religion, for
Mhm.
fear of being, branded as godless and anti-Christian. But if they are not educating people about what you're talking about, Andra, they are missing one of the largest pieces of an authoritarian takeover of the United States that is currently happening. And
It's
and they
really
won't talk about it.
it's really horrible that the best example of journalism on that regard that I've seen recently was Tucker Carlson interviewing Ted Cruz. But we need so much more of that kind of pushback. So one of the things that I did yesterday in writing about this notion of prayer in the wake of disasters, and in my newsletter that's coming later today about the dignity of work, is that I give people talking points to push back on. Some journalists read my work, and I see more of them starting to talk about Christian nationalism now. So I keep putting things out there that journalists and other Americans can use to push back. So specific things you can say, and specific verses even in today's post that you can use. And just like Ted Cruz, they're going to be like, I don't know what verse you're talking about. I was just indoctrinated by my pastor to say these things. But you'll actually have some verses and some receipts if you read today's newsletter. So, to use for pushback. So I'm trying to give
Whatever.
people some things to use really early before we're just inundated with these talking points all the time. And we're going to be. So get ready.
Yep, and one of the ways that you get ready is you subscribe to Andra Watkins, for a time such as this. It really is essential reading, so I hope folks aren't just reading, Andra's Substack and Lincoln Square and the other, pro-democracy outlets out there, but you when you are able, you are financially supporting. You are taking out paid subscriptions. You are sending small donations to groups who are doing the work, because these are these are essential jobs that people are doing now, and they're not working somewhere else where they could be making a lot more money, and probably
That's
doing a whole hell of a lot less work and less stress and could tune out, but people aren't doing that. There
mhm.
are huge numbers of people who are doing this work every day, and support people as you can. I know people don't like paying for what they consider media, but, this is what we have right now, and I promise you, if you are watching, mainstream media, you are paying for it because you are being you're being advertised to all the damn time, and don't think that people advertise because it has absolutely no impact on how people behave. So,
Mhm.
you're not getting ads, on Substack, but you are being asked when you can to please support the Substacks that you're reading. So, thank you to all of you, who do that for us. And thank you for those of you who are not able, to take out paid subscriptions, but you're sharing the work and you're doing the work. So, there are lots of ways to contribute, and I know, huge numbers of you are. So thank you. And thank you, Andra, for being here. As always, we will talk again next Wednesday morning.
It's such a treat to see you. I look forward to this every week.
Yeah, I do too. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.